we are very aware that for the majority might be a bit strong, but for a lot of people in the kind of knowledge working space, life is less than fun sometimes.
Hi there, Ben. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Cool. So I was thinking before we jumped on this, like I first met you at a really informal Cynefin meetup. It was just like four of us with Jules in a pub in the before times. And I really enjoyed, we grabbed a coffee after that and we just nerded out about loads of topics around complexity and things like that. And I've really been looking forward to carrying on those threads of conversation. One of the themes for today that we were thinking about beforehand is when you really grok complexity, it can be quite easy to just like throw up your hands and go, give up, or just go back to the old habits you had and presume it's going to be fine. So in this community, we're really interested in what we can actually do about it. So, and it's particularly around what do we do at work? What's the future of work? How do we keep learning lifelong, personal development, mental health, all of those things? So yeah, with that, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so I come from a very technical background. I served in the military and then dove into, being a software developer. And, for quite a long time, I thought, okay, this is all good. The military was a fun diversion when I was younger. But actually the last sort of 5 years, I would say that the scale of change, I mean, it's an accelerating sort of edge of change, isn't it? So, things are getting faster and faster, things get out of date quicker and quicker, which means that you need to be able to change your mind and you need to be able to adapt. And, dare I say it, you need to be agile. And I would say that probably 90% of the businesses I've worked in are not any of those things, and they are therefore quite stressful and unpleasant places to work because they're basically trying to do the old school things that don't work anymore, and they're just trying to do them harder. So that's what led me away from reading more computer science books and into trying to discover about complexity. And we can probably dig into my little corner of that world. I found the OODA loop and essentially found my mental model for everything, which we can certainly open to challenge. But that's the bridge between my military background and the world we live in today. It's like, how do you manage the chaos and complexity of a very fast changing situation?
That makes sense. Yeah, I remember we talked before about your journey. You were a commando and then a developer. And you, for a long time, you said you didn't realize that they were the same thing in a way. So what triggered that realization when you figured out you could make that connection? What was it that triggered that?
This is a good time to have this conversation because yesterday was the 20-year anniversary of the day I received my green beret. So this is a good time to reflect. So I'm glad we're
Big
having
day.
this conversation. So as I was an individual contributor, early teens, so 10 years or so ago, cloud wasn't really that much of a thing. AWS was around, but not very prevalent. And that was kind of, I guess the tail end of the old days, right? You'd buy some iron to run your code on, you'd SSH into it, you'd copy your stuff over. And, for the next sort of 3 or 4 years, it was write code, ship code, and, fairly simple. And then I moved into startups and I built my own team. So then I had kind of, leadership and setting direction to start thinking about. And I also had prioritization and deciding what was the right thing to do of all the various different options. And I found that most of what I had available in the software development community was inadequate for that. You've got agile, which I think the vast majority of the agile kind of literature and thinking is based around big companies that are stable and want to be more efficient. But actually the world of fast change and startups is actually really much more about effectiveness. It's no good if you're efficient if you're doing the wrong thing. So I started that's where my kind of research into this started. Ended up finding, I found the Cynefin community. First mention of that I ever found was in Stan McChrystal's book, Team of Teams. So this is where I was starting to kind of bridge, Team of Teams, extreme ownership. I was starting to bridge my inklings of we used to do stuff like this in the military and it worked kind of well, to somebody actually sitting down thinking about it and writing about it, and me being able to then bridge my experience using those books, and then from there branching out into Cynefin, from Cynefin probably Wardley mapping, and then at some point the OODA loop popped up, and that was it, game over. Or game just started actually.
Game finally understood the basic structure of the game. Now we can actually play.
Yes, perhaps, yeah. The fractal nature of the game, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned you've seen this mistake being made by loads of organizations. And I think I can see that too. What's behind that? Why are they stuck?
So, well, that's probably not something we're going to get a definitive answer to in an hour. But I think there are a few themes that perhaps are starting to emerge for me. So perhaps, we can dig into those. I think most businesses now are not aware of how quickly it's possible to do things. So certainly big companies, big software development teams, lots of legacy, they are completely, their sense making is completely broken because they don't understand that a small team can do what they do orders of magnitude faster, better, without all of the constraints that they have. So they're kind of, their thinking about how to do things is maybe 10 years old, into a world that 10 years is a long time, but 10 years from now is a much shorter time than 10 years backwards, if that makes sense. So I think we're still far too over-indexed on top-down, being directed by leaders who have experience, rather than being led by the experience that we're currently having, because they're not the same thing. I can perhaps unpack that a little bit more if I sort of skipped over something a little bit too quickly there.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I can think of examples as well where stories and teams that I've worked with where there's one team who are spending 2 years trying to get something pretty simple just to happen, and it ends up completely not happening and failing and costs money. And another team that I worked with recently who stood up something incredibly complicated in 8 days and then iterated on it every week until it's singing, and it's a totally different way of operating. One thing that I think is interesting is that faster agile way of operating isn't so much of an intellectual challenge as an emotional challenge. And then we get into the mental health side. What do you think? Tell us more about that.
That's a really, really good observation. So it's a mental challenge in that you have to open yourself up to failure. You have to constantly, and in a very disciplined way, expose yourself to being wrong again and again and again. And so, one of the things I kind of like talking about is Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, one of the martial arts that I enjoy doing. And that's kind of the same thing, right? In order to get better, sorry, my screen just, in order to get better at Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, you go and roll with people that are better than you, who expose you to how bad you are again and again and again, sometimes several times a minute. And it's a challenge, right? It's an ego hit to do that. And, the people in that community talk about that all the time. So I think the difference between a team that's going to, to extrapolate that observation from an individual learning a skill, and, it's the same when I learn programming as well. It's like, literally bang my head against the table until I figure something out. But if you extrapolate that from an individual to a team, the dynamics in a team are completely different. If you get a leader in there who is an old, old school is not really specific enough, but somebody who sets a direction and wants things done as he or she has laid out, that is antithetical to that exposing yourself to failure, because the plan is the plan, and when the plan fails, that's a big problem, versus the plan is a direction and we change direction as we go along, which is what, you know, the second example that you gave, we're doing. You know, that's the whole point of delivering every week, is so that you get to learn. It's not delivering a 6-month part of a 6-month plan every week. It's sense making and figuring out what needs to be done next every week, and sometimes failing. You know, one out of every 3 weeks you might screw something up, but then you learn.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And that touches on something where you mentioned planning and you mentioned strategy, and I think people often mix those two up and think that strategy is this big thing that the people in charge do, and then they deliver a plan, and then we follow the plan, and then when the plan changes, we feel like, oh, the strategy's changed, we're just thrashing around with no strategy. I think that's a mistake. Talk more about that.
Yeah, so I have a sort of my mental model of strategy. I mean, strategy is obviously at this point is as nebulous a word as agile is. So my feeling about strategy is that strategy needs to be it needs to be a little bit nebulous. It's not something concrete. So that's what separates strategy from a plan. You know, a plan is we want to achieve X by Y. A strategy is, this is the opportunity, this is the macroeconomic trend, this is the direction of travel, this is the broad idea. And then so if you have a strategy as a plan and the conditions change, you've already emotionally invested in the plan. So you have to sort of climb this energy barrier to undo that emotional investment in the plan before you can change the plan. Whereas if you're delivering small incremental things, you know, the bet is smaller. The energy, you know, the energy hill that you have to climb in order to undecide something is less. And I think that's completely congruent within, you know, a broad strategy is like, you know, this is what we think is going to happen in 6 months. What we do in 6 months to deliver something that is congruent with that strategy, we're completely open to, and you know, may well change. And you know, if you're in an organization that change does not equate to someone's ego getting hurt, you're perfectly free to do that. If it does equate to somebody's ego getting hurt, then you're in all sorts of trouble. And that's where I think we often run into problems in businesses and organizations.
I think that makes a lot of sense. What do you do about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the problem, right? I mean, the problem, and you know, that now we're kind of skirting into areas of sort of what's the word I'm looking for here? We're starting to think about therapy for people, for individuals now, rather than intervening in teams. So team dynamics, obviously, a team is a different unit of reasoning than an individual. But if you've got an individual that is the top of a team, and the team is formed around that individual, and they're not a good leader, then it's that individual who has to have a bit of help. And if their failing is about, you know, feeling personally attacked when something goes wrong, or, you know, not taking feedback, then you've got a mountain to climb before you even start improving the team. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I had a conversation on this yesterday, pretty much, right? You know, that there's only so much leadership development you can do before you're kind of veering on that cliff edge of, you know, are we doing therapy now?
Yeah, I think I chatted. Oh, go on, John.
2020, we know, has been a kind of strange year, and it's going to take years for us to put it into perspective what it all means and what we've learned from it and what the mistakes were. But I think it's fair to say over the last 5-10 years, there's been a renewed interest in stoicism. And running alongside that, there is the controversy surrounding people like Jordan Peterson although Jordan Peterson is a bestseller, he sold 3 million plus books. Now that to me suggests that there's a need out there for tools to understand or navigate complexity, tools for sense making. So I wondered, do you agree with that? And what does your background or experience, or what can you share about the dilemma that some, and often it's males, white males, but they are, they're trying to improve themselves. So we've gone from organizational complexity, team complexity, now we're talking about the individual. So I hope that makes sense, and I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah. So I'm aware of Jordan Peterson. I bought one of his books, but never read it after he was on, I think, either a Tim Ferriss or a Jocko Willink podcast. And I read a few of his articles. I watched the horrific interview with him on Channel 4,
the infamous
where the conversation ended up being about lobsters or something, incredibly asinine. And that there are some things that seem to be incredibly difficult to have a conversation about these days. Largely because the dialogue has moved on to 2 points of being very, very sort of diametrically opposed. And I think we could put our hand in the air and pick any of the big issues of the day. Brexit, US election, the EU, anything like that. I think one of the issues in today's society is that so there was a great couple of podcasts. In fact, John, you shared one, The War on Sense Making, with Daniel Schmattenberger. I listened to, I didn't hear that one, but I did listen to his guest appearance on Jim Rutt's podcast. And, the thing that struck out to me about that was that our relationships with each other are increasingly mediated through an invisible kind of platform or platforms, right? So, we're all sitting here having this one-to-one conversation, and it's a direct conversation about the topics that we're talking about right now. And that's how human history and communication has worked forever. That's how we're biologically wired to be able to communicate. But increasingly, invisibly, what bubbles up to our attention is mediated by a platform of some sort. And increasingly, those platforms are actually, they are incentivized to get our attention, and not through any necessarily nefarious design. They've built models that have decided that the best way to get people's attention is to outrage them or anger them or disgust them or to play on negative emotions. So, in the midst of this increasing complexity in our kind of daily lives and society, we're also attenuating or sub-optimizing our ability to have dialogue and to have like open conversations. And that is a massive problem, as we can sort of see with all of the issues that we face in our sort of Western societies at the moment.
It's just
I don't think that was a particularly an answer, but
I mean, it was definitely an answer. It just clicking with your thought that if the team is being held back by someone who's fundamentally ego trapped, and really what they need is therapy to help them over that personal blocker, is that what we're facing, but on a societal scale? Therapy for all.
So yes, I think that there is part of that, right? There's a I think people would broadly agree that as societies become easier places to live in, i.e., more materially advanced, less difficult from a kind of an existential point of view, that we tend to become a bit soft. And I think maybe this is one of the attractions of Stoicism. It's that you don't rely on anything. You're self-sufficient, you're tough in a way. And I think, I mean, I don't really have a strong opinion on this. I think you'll see many people saying that, the current generation is somehow weak or pampered or didn't have it as bad as we did or whatever, which, to some degree is, I suppose, fair. And when people don't have that challenge, you have to practice that kind of challenge, and when people don't have that practice, then I guess it's easier for things to slip into the realm of the ego quicker than perhaps the generation beforehand would have. On the other hand, previous generations have the shadows of war, of the trauma of war to deal with. Like our parents and our grandparents' generations would have actually had to deal with some pretty measurably awful trauma.
Yeah.
So there's that mitigation as well. So it's not a simple, what would have been a stiff upper lip would in the 50s and 60s that isn't there now would also be a potentially a lack of addressing underlying issues as well and just getting on with it. So swings and roundabouts, I think.
Yeah, like with complex systems. But it seems like you are then drawn to situations where you are faced with having to deal with hardship and facing up to the fact that you're wrong about something. I imagine the military training was not a soft thing, and then choosing to do jiu-jitsu, you're just saying, yes, please beat me up over and over again. What draws you to that?
I mean, we martial artists probably like to tell themselves a story that, they're somehow, more I don't know, virtuous. I was about to say virtuous is a silly word, but I mean, I think my brain is attracted to finding ever deeper levels of abstraction. And when I find a situation that exposes me to that, my brain is attracted to that to the degree that it's prepared to put up with some hardship. So, for example, when I found, it's not just martial arts, when I found functional programming, which is a different type of programming that's more rigorous and much more difficult to get into than the Python programming I was doing, I was not just willing to put up with that difficulty, I actually sort it out, which is pretty unusual for me. I'm actually quite a lazy person. The discipline that I had in the military mostly evaporated after I left the military. It's very situational. But I didn't have any problems getting up 5 a.m. to get in a few hours of Haskell programming before work, because it was a vehicle for learning. So there was something about the attraction of learning these abstractions, and maybe that's the kind of pattern matching part of our of our makeup as humans that was attracting me to figuring out this stuff. But then that's also the side of people that pushes them away from complexity because they crave certainty in some ways.
It's interesting. I definitely saw an article really recently about that, the idea that interestingness is something we detect when we suspect that there's a simplification we can make by abstracting something.
Right.
And it's when the brain starts to detect, oh yeah, that's messy, but there's something under there, and I can figure it out. Then that's what makes something interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely a reward mechanism for finding a pattern, right? I mean, this is why narrative is so powerful, because it's much easier to believe a narrative that flows well, even if it ends up in a bizarre place, than it is to string together disparate facts, which is one of the reasons why society's sense making is so broken, is because the antidote to disinformation, unfortunately, is not better information, it's a better story. So that's a problem, because the people in charge of telling better stories tend to be the ones that, well, I don't know, I think they're the ones that are in control at the moment, and They don't seem to be the ones that are, altruistically focusing on a better life for us all at the moment.
Could I spin that? Could I spin that round slightly, if I may, and say, given what you've learned about complexity, so the journey through Wardley mapping, Cynefin, and now the OODA loop, if you go back to your days of just starting Python programming, what would you tell yourself?
Wow. So actually, my days of starting Python programming didn't have any complexity at all. Really, I learned on board a warship with no internet and one book, my laptop. So I would actually say, don't try and complexify this, right? You've got the tools that you need to learn. Because like, if I was to be doing that now, 17 years later, with all of the world's dopamine a mere click away, I think I'd struggle. Like, I think I would actually find it more difficult in some ways to become a programmer now than I would have sat below decks of a ship with no internet access and one book to study.
So your advice would be keep it simple. However, the design
that really works for complexity, but unfortunately, that's where I've come to.
That said, though, the design of contemporary systems are often for social use, and they'll also have a component of machine learning built in. So I understand what you're saying from a software engineering point of view. I'm a software engineer by training, keeping things simple, not being distracted.
Yeah.
But really, in a way, I would say that is no longer the case. I think that you can say to learn the basics of the technical aspects of programming, which is a bit like mathematics. Here's the book, here's the time to practice. We'll tell you if you're right or you're wrong. But once you start to use that to develop new things, new systems that will be used by other people, that's where complexity and chaos and all the dangers with bias, with data and things like that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Actually, that is a very good point. So, what you would learn as a programmer now would be very different to what you would learn, but what I learned from the single book that I had, right? If you're an outcome-driven programmer now, you'd probably start with no code tools, which are all provided, as a package by other entities, companies or individuals. You would maybe do some, front-end JavaScript programming. You would be able to have much more of an effect. Like, you would be able to have a much higher power to weight ratio than I would with my Python and my, my single source of information.
And no
One
internet.
of the things I like about modern, sorry to interrupt, Tom, just to follow up on that point. One of the things I like about software development, and especially open source software, is that you can go to a GitHub repo to find a component or a tool or an application to use. And as a software engineer, to understand the system, how it works, what functionality it provides, is to read the test scripts. And over time, you can learn to read the test scripts in any language: Haskell, Python, Java, C#. So given that, can you ever foresee a time where that could happen with other artifacts, Wardley maps or Cynefin diagrams? So developing artifacts or living documents in the open, say on GitHub, as a way of learning and sense making at the same time.
Yeah, I can. And I think it comes back to abstraction, right? It's when you're looking through somebody's code. Like, I remember when I became a reasonably good developer, you develop this kind of sense of intuition when you look at someone's code, right? And that can be from, you can squint at it and the structure of the code, like, you know, if it goes in like this and out like that, it means that there's loads of nested if statements or for loops. It means it's probably not well designed. You know, if there's functions that are hundreds of lines long, it means that it's doing too much. So you get all these sort of heuristics and guidelines, but you have to have a certain amount of experience and intuition in order to interpret what you're sensing. And I think that the challenge of building, you know, organizations in complex circumstances is packaging up those, you know, units of intuition in such a way that they accelerate people's learning. So, you know, in Haskell, let's take Haskell for example, because the abstractions in Haskell tend to be far smaller and more atomic. So I could look at a piece of Haskell code and seeing that there's a certain type of abstraction there, I could know much more about the interface of what that piece of code is allowed to do. Whereas in Python, the same expressing the same thing could be done in multiple different ways, called multiple different things, or not called anything at all, and it would be down to my experience to figure out what I'm looking at. So I think there's, if I could sort of paraphrase what you said, John, it's like, how do we package up these units of reusable intuition so that people don't have to make the same, don't have to expend the same mental energy to be able to use that knowledge. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, if we're here to talk about Cynefin, obviously, but if we talk about a Wardley map, a map as code, well, yes, it's similar to, it's been codified. So then it can be transmitted. It then can be forked by other groups or individuals, expanded upon, and perhaps put back into the community to be used further down the line. So the connection is, it's not software components, but living documents,
yeah,
of any kind.
Yeah, I mean, so I actually think that this is an area that's not been that explored yet, because there aren't these kind of, I mean, you know, a Wardley map is still a tool for having a conversation. It's still a tool for mediating a transfer of knowledge among people. It's not like a, you know, it's not like an XML document or an RDF that describes with complete detail, you know, a business model, for example. But that being said, I do think that there's one of my favorite books that I've read over the last couple of years is The Origin of Wealth by Eric Beinhacker, which talks about, you know, business models as a kind of an evolutionary fitness landscape for business models. And your job as a person starting a company is to, you know, basically get your company up some evolutionary hill such that that company is now self-sustaining. And I think if you were to look at, you know, elements of a Wardley map as you know, strands of DNA, you know, you could start from nothing, knowing nothing about business, and you could try a lot of stuff and you could waste a lot of money. Or you could say, right, this is the industry I'm in. This is the team size I have. This is the market that I'm addressing, this kind of thing. And if there was a repository of sort of, you know, Wardley mapping DNA, you could bootstrap your first Wardley map in such a way that you would expend less energy getting to a sustainable, you know, local maxima of development. So you know, if we ever got to the point where Wardley maps were implementable in some way, right? You could take a Wardley map and you could say, right, this is how we do sales, or this is how we do onboarding, or this is how we do, you know, something. And you could say that these are the elements that we need. These is how they fit together. These are how they communicate. Then I think that definitely you could see a world where you could take that specification, you could make changes to it, and then you could offer those changes back to a community. And then, you know, and then, you know, that entity or that unit of functionality would then evolve somehow. Yeah.
So would you say you refer back to what you said earlier about social media platforms? The current generation of social media platforms have a business model that is really about, they are attention merchants,
Mm-hmm.
and they're protected by Section 230 as well. So we have echo chambers are easy to, or echo chambers emerge from that. So what you're saying is that if we had platforms that allowed collaboration and the creation of artifacts, they could actually replace the current generation of social media. You could still, GitHub have recently launched GitHub discussions, which I think is really interesting. So it's a kind of a mix between Slack, discourse. But what you've got there then is you've got a set of features or functionality to enable communication, and that combined with distributed version control and the ability to work on an artifact with many different people involved and track changes. If you combine those together, what GitHub provides then is a platform to build the next generation of not social media, but learning in the open platforms.
Mm. So kind of like, so one of the sort of software architecture patterns I like is architectural decision records, where you record the context in which a decision is being made, you record the decision itself, and you record any kind of knock-on effects, or we are knowingly pessimizing this in order to optimize this because this is the problem that we have right now. So one way of describing what you just explained, John, might be like cultural decision records. So you can have this kind of network of, or graph actually, because it's a DAG of cultural decisions is not quite right, but cultural shifts that build into a graph of this is our understanding or our body of knowledge, something like that.
I'm working at a bit lower level than that, but I think I can understand what you're saying. But if you go back to Wardley maps, and I agree, some aspects of Wardley maps need to remain private. They can give away too much of the intention of a business, the plan and the strategy. But I think Wardley maps can also be useful to see patterns emerge. Mm-hmm. So for example, if you're a company and you suddenly need a payment system or a user registration system, it's a recurring pattern that you see in many systems. Well, if you could search there's similar systems in Golang, for the Go programming language. Mm-hmm. So you can just go and search for certain modules. So what Wardley Maps needs is maps of code. Well, we've got that, but then we also need the metadata to go with that as well. So that will emerge. I can see that happening over the next 12 months. So instead of creating a map for a payment system from scratch and understanding where the market is in terms of evolution, you go and find subcomponents or submaps.
Yeah.
So mapping becomes then the idea of putting together novel combinations of submaps. So it's not cultural, it's a technical, solving technical problems. But on top of that, then you can document what that's for, the code of conduct and all the other things that are needed for that, which can then be shared and improved by other people.
I mean, we might not have the bandwidth to go down the philosophical rabbit hole of to what degree technical and cultural systems can be separated. But no, I agree with that. If, I mean, a Wardley map has a data model, a data structure underlying it, which is pretty much similar to what I just said, right? It's a graph of nodes that have links, and there's no reason why you couldn't have, a super graph. You could have multi-dimensional Wardley maps so that you can have, here's the top node of a payment plan, a payment module, and somebody else's graph or multiple other companies or organizations' graph could refer to that, pass that map in by reference.
One other thought is, I think there's two bits to Wardley mapping I find useful. One is the collaboration aspect. So here's the map, and we route everything. We blame the map rather than the person. So all the challenge goes through the map. And then that can be published and reused as a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
I think on something which is a distributed version control, which you don't get in Google Docs at the moment.
Yeah.
And I also understand that GitHub is too complex. It needs to be simplified. It needs different interfaces for different user groups. But the ability to version different documents. Let's go back, rather than just Wardley maps, just talk about any type of document.
Yep.
But I will have to refer back to Wardley maps to make my point. But what is important, I think, is to see how that document evolves over time, because that's another learning aspect. So you can go back to version 1 of a map and say, well, that's where they were. That's what they thought they needed to do. You go to version 97, and it's actually completely the opposite way around. And I can see patterns emerging from that as well. Saying this is how we think a value chain is today, but actually it turns out to be completely opposite. That will only happen with people collaborating and sharing maps in the public in the public domain, or learning in the open. But it's going to be interesting to see if that happens. I hope it does.
That is actually, so just to get really sort of nerdy and technical for a minute, the underlying data model of a Wardley map and the underlying data model of an online document and the version control operations that happen on those things, it's completely possible to have, so sometimes, version control operates on the textual representation of a programming language. But you could represent programming languages as the abstract syntax tree of operation. It doesn't have to be text. So, the same technology that powered Google Wave and now powers, the multiple, being able to edit things at the same time in Google Docs could absolutely be applied to Wardley mapping. It's a CRDT, conflict-free replicated data type. And graph structures fit that perfectly. So you could absolutely build a system of representing Wardley maps that had a version controlled graph underneath it, and then you'd be able to reason about the changes in the graph just as well as you would about the kind of representation of the graph. So yeah, I think that would be a very, very cool tool to have.
Yeah, I want that now. I'm thinking it's making me think, well, like Rome Research, which we are both fans of, that's based around a graph as well.
Yep.
Could you build?
It's based around a graph and also events that update the graph. So it's very, very close to what we're talking about already. Yeah.
Already, yeah. Just needs a way of making it look like a Wardley map then, or something that would be grokkable as that.
Do you know that is not far off, because somebody's already made a way of visualizing a Rome Research graph as a graph is dot diagram. So I actually think you could almost do that now without very much work at all.
Gosh, and you'd also then get the sort of the interconnection where, Simon talks about this, every node on the map is a map itself.
Yep.
And that would be very easy in Rome Trivial to do that bit of it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I've speculated, it'll be interesting to see what you think about this. We are drifting off on a tangent here, but it's interesting.
That's good. I like tangents.
That Rome Research is actually what the internet should have been like. And I do wonder if at some point we'll be surprised when Google acquire Rome Research and actually just make it a completely open system that runs alongside the internet.
I've certainly seen Tim Berners-Lee or read him saying that he wishes he'd gone for bidirectional links. That was a choice they knew they were making and thought that the unidirectional was right back then. They didn't know what was going to happen.
So far we've got two visions. One is open learning built on GitHub, user-friendly, or open learning on some version of Rome that's built on Google infrastructure. I think it's built on in Google, it's Firebase it's built on, I believe.
Yeah, I think they're talking about moving to, well, they built everything in Clojure, and they're talking about moving to Datomic or something like that. But again, you know, sort of concrete choice of technology aside, the abstraction that they're using is that it's an event source where events are folded into some state, and the state of your graph is therefore, you know, it's the current state of the world now, but it also contains all of the experience that's built up to it. So, you know, we're back to, you know, this is an OODA loop for me, right? An OODA loop is built on a series of events that have happened in the past that go into your state, your orientation. And, you know, that's completely congruent with how the systems that we've been discussing at an abstract level and Rome research at a concrete level work.
So there's a graph database or distributed version control. But how about a third option, which is augmented reality, video? Because what we're talking about in the first two are really codified documents. What about the next level, conversational programming?
Yeah, I mean, even that still fits the same model, right? You've got some underlying, you know, the video is a thing, but you've got timestamps in that video that you point to. You've got transcripts of that video that you pull out that point to timestamps. And you've got potentially bidirectional links from concepts that are mentioned in that video to other videos or other text or other Wardley maps or whatever. So you've got this kind of, it is a knowledge graph, but I think what you can represent at the nodes is open, right? It's an ongoing evolution.
There we go. Well,
so
on that bombshell.
On that bombshell. So 2020, as I was said before, is it needs to be digested. There's such a lot going on, and as you know, there's the economic consequences to follow. So let's look forward to 2021, Ben. What's your plans for the coming, say, 12 months? So your OODA loop, complexity, Cynefin, Wardley maps, what are you going to be looking forward to next year?
So I'm very much looking forward to working more with the pioneers, who I've done a couple of projects with this year. You know, we are very aware that for the majority might be a bit strong, but for a lot of people in the kind of knowledge working space, life is less than fun sometimes, you know, when we don't have these kind of the right communication structure, the right situational awareness, you know, the right leadership. So I'm very much looking forward to working more with them and helping companies kind of unpick all this stuff. I'm also really looking forward to having the space. I'm hoping that I'm going to get to have the space to actually tackle some of the technical complexities of making this happen. I think, you know, at the level we're talking about, there needs to be a technological augmentation of people, because, you know, we've only got so much bandwidth as humans. We've got all of these capabilities out there for aggregating information, and, you know, why would you have a human, you know, pulling out his calculator to do sums that can be done automatically by you know, essentially logging the events that happen and aggregating that information yourself. So I'm you know, very focused on the intersection of, you know, the human side of complexity and the you know, whatever the technology platform is that helps to mitigate some of that. So that's my focus for 2021, certainly.